Well done, brothers and sisters. Well done. Well done.
All right. Hey, don't sit down. Got a couple of verses we're going to read. Did you guys have a good Thanksgiving? Yes, sir. Did you step on the scale this morning? And stay away from that, huh? Hopefully you had a good Thanksgiving and enjoyed that. Let me read to you. This is in Numbers chapter 21. And so we've been going through the Exodus, and the beginning of the year we started in Genesis. We finished that, and then we did the Exodus. But some of this, you just need to understand that it bleeds over into Numbers. So the first 5 books of the Bible are called the Pentateuch. Penta means 5. So it's the first 5 books. Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. I think you guys should all read through those 5 books to get familiar with this, because it doesn't always happen in chronological order in terms of like we're in Exodus, and about halfway through it jumps over to, now you got to go over to the book of Numbers to see what's going on. And this is where we're at. And it says this. It says, then the people of Israel set out from Mount Hor, taking the road to the Red Sea to go around the land of Edom. But the people grew impatient with the long journey and began to speak against God and Moses. "Why have you brought us out of Egypt to die here in the wilderness?" they complained. There is nothing to eat here and nothing to drink, and we hate this horrible manna. So that goes back to what we talked about last week. You can be seated. Yeah, so we're talking about today learning to be grateful. And sometimes that is a learned behavior and a learned attitude. I have this, go ahead and put that up on the slide, on the screen. This is in my office. It sits on my desk, and this says Missouri Complaint Department. Push the red button to complain. And just a little funny thing. Are you guys not awake yet? All right, so listen. So do you know some complainers? Do you know some people who are just like always, is it you? Because I find myself, like I always lament about people. I don't like to be around complainers, and then I find myself doing it too. So we're probably, if we're honest, we all struggle a little bit in that. So here's what we've been doing. Here's what we've been talking about. 2 times ago that I preached, we talked about, so the children of Israel came out of Egypt. I mean, God was so good to them. He delivered them from their bondage of 400 years of slavery where they were just oppressed. And God brought them out of that. And they came out to the desert, right, where God, in order to get to the promised land, you had to leave slavery, but to get to the promised land, you had to go through the desert. It just makes sense. And so they're out there, and they begin to complain a lot. Like every time you turn around, they're just complaining. And listen, it's not even not legitimate things. Like they got out to the desert 2 times ago. I talked about water. They were like, "Moses, we don't have any water." But it's how they told him. Like they were like, "You just brought us out here to kill us, to die." And Moses went and pled before God for them, and God gave them water. And it was a miracle. And then last week we talked about similar situation. Now they're hungry, and they're like, "We're starving. You brought us out here to kill us." And Moses talk to God, and God goes, okay, I'm going to give them some food, and he gave them food. Remember what it was? It was called manna, and so not only that, but he also had quail fly in and just cover the whole camp, and all you had to do was reach out and grab some quail, and you had, dinner, and then manna was, nobody really knows what it is, but it's basically an ingredient. So you could go out every morning for 40 years. They went out, they woke up and they went outside. The whole ground was covered with manna, and you go and collect some and put it in a basket or whatever, and you could eat it just like that, like Frosted Flakes or whatever it was, corn flakes, and put sugar on it, whatever you want to do. Now, what a lot of times they did was they would grind it up and make flour out of it, and they could bake all kinds of cakes and breads and all kinds of stuff. So they were pretty creative. And so they complained about that, and then God gave them quail, and remember they're eating the quail, and while they were gorging themselves with the quail, God got angry with them and sent a plague, and it killed a bunch of them. And so he smote a bunch of people during that time. Now, there's 3 stories we're going to look at today, and only 2 of them we're going to actually look up. But the 3 stories is, so there was numerous times where the children of Israel, like 2 million people, minus the ones that got smote. I don't know how many that was. But you got all these people, and they're just complaining all the time. And it starts, like it's, the Bible talks about like yeast, a little leavens a whole lump or whatever, and so it spreads like wildfire. And so somebody starts griping and complaining. Before you know it, the whole crowd is ready to literally they were going to pick up stones and kill Moses at certain times. And so you got the crowd that complains against Moses, and then there's another story that we're going to get to where some of the leaders start to complain against Moses. And then this story that we're getting ready to talk about next is the story where his family, now we got family drama. The family's complaining, his brother and sister. Now I know that you don't ever have family drama at your house, in your family. I know it's probably perfect. In fact, I don't know if it was a meme or whatever it was, it just said pro tip or whatever. It said, talk about politics over Thanksgiving, and you'll save yourself a Christmas gift. So you just ruin everything right off the jump. So anyways, so let's talk about this, and here's what I want you to write down if you're taking notes. I have 3 observations about this, and the first one is this, is that being a leader is not for the faint of heart. Have you noticed this before? Have anyone in here who, if you've ever had a leadership position, if you were on a sports team and a leader, or if you were at your job or leader at church, it all seems great from the outside looking in. Like people look and go, oh, that would be great to do that. But they don't realize how much you have to go through to that. They don't see the day-to-day grind on that. So being a leader is not for the faint of heart. And let me just really quick, little side note. We're going to be talking about leadership 2 weeks in January. But before we get there, next week when you come in, for the next 4 weeks, and the last one being Christmas Eve, we're starting a new series next week called The Carols of Christmas. And every week we're only going to be singing Christmas carols. And so if you have a favorite Christmas carol, if you send it to Chad, get a hold of Chad and say, hey, could we sing this? We can't guarantee you that we will, but just put in a request. He might honor that. And so the Carols of Christmas starts next week. And then, and by the way, in December, 17th? Was 16th, we're doing the Christmas concert, but the 17th is Ugly Christmas Sweater contest that day. So wear an ugly Christmas sweater, and the winner gets a prize. And I'll just tell you, if you wear a Denver Broncos sweater, you're probably going to win the ugliest sweater contest. All right, so but then we get into January. So this is what January 7th is a big deal for us because that's our anniversary Sunday, and this is 10 years. Grace Church is 10 years old. We have a big celebration planned. Yeah. So we're looking forward to that. And then the next 2 weeks, we're going to be talking about leadership from lessons that we learned from Moses. Okay, so leadership, being a leader is not for the faint of heart. Let's see this in Numbers chapter 12, verse 1. If you have a Bible, you need to bring a Bible to church every week. Amen? Somebody say amen. Bring a Bible to church. Verse 1 says, while they were at Hazeroth, it says Miriam and Aaron criticized Moses because he had married a Cushite woman. Now, there's a lot there. We're not going to go down that rabbit hole about the who he married and why and all that, but you just need to understand that Aaron was Moses' brother and Miriam was his sister. And, okay, I will give someone 100 points if you can tell me what Miriam's job was. She was a worship leader, yeah. So, which is interesting too, because Satan, when he was in heaven, was the worship leader. And then he lusted after the power that God had. He wanted people to worship him, and God kicked him out of heaven and prepared hell for him. Anyways, so let's go on. So it says that Miriam and Aaron criticized Moses because he had married a Cushite woman. They said, has the Lord spoken through only through Moses? Hasn't he spoken through us too? But the Lord heard them. Now Moses was very humble, more humble than any other person on earth. Now, number two, I'll just write this down, is that Aaron and Miriam were craving power. They craved more power. See, they were one of the leaders. Like, she was the worship leader. Aaron was the high priest, the head priest. And so, but there was something about this, and I'm just reading into this, but they were jealous of Moses. We see that. And they probably looked at him and goes, man, look at Moses, man. Everybody's coming to him. Everybody's applauding him for being a great leader. And that does something to people. And you have to be very careful. I'm just telling you, like at where you work, if you envy those who are leaders and go, man, I wish I had their job, you have to be careful because you will connive and you'll compromise. You'll do things that lacks integrity to try to bring someone down to your level or so that you could take their job. And I'm just telling you, being a leader is not always what's cracked up to be. You look at the external, and I've done this. I'm a pastor, and I know of other pastors, and I know pastors with big churches and good churches, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I kind of envy their situation. They got all the money they know. I mean, I know pastors that when they do a building campaign, all the money comes in and they build these buildings and there's no problem. And that's not the case for us, but that's all right. God's still going to bless. But just because it hasn't happened yet doesn't mean it's not going to. But I look at that, and then I look at these other pastors, and I spend time with them, and I realize that it's not all it's cracked up to be, And I know pastors who have large churches that don't get out of bed on Monday and Tuesday because they suffer depression so bad because they're getting their identity from how many people are at church or how the offering was or whatever it is. And all I'm telling you is through the years I've learned about leadership, whether it's at a job or at a church or whatever it is. I don't know what other people are going through. And so I need to be very careful about lusting after their position, envying somebody's situation, because I don't know what they did to get there. They might have worked a lot harder than what I'm willing to work to get there. And I don't know what they have to endure to maintain that. And neither do you. So we just need to be comfortable in that and be careful not to criticize your leaders. And so I want to go back to the verse 3. Okay, look at this. This is amazing to me. Here's what it says. It says, now Moses, so they're criticizing him, and Aaron and Miriam, their brother and sister of Moses. It says, now Moses was very humble, more humble than any other person on earth. That is incredible. How cool would it be that if you were in the Bible, right? If you got included in the Bible as a Bible character and it said about you that you were the most humble person on earth, wouldn't that be amazing? Really quick, let me just do a recap. Do you remember who wrote the book of Numbers? Do you know who wrote that? Go to the next slide. Look at this. This is funny to me. This is hilarious. There's Moses writing, more humble than... okay, so let me just talk about this, because when I just read this, I was just like, oh my... That's pretty incredible. Now, here's what I do believe. I believe that the Bible is inspired by God from cover to cover. There's no errors in it. So you need to understand that Moses, let me just give you some context here. Moses wrote Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and most of Deuteronomy. Okay? So that's the Pentateuch. Penta means 5. And so Jesus, in the New Testament, referenced back and said that Moses wrote the Pentateuch. But there's no way that Moses could have wrote the whole thing, because in the book of Deuteronomy, at the end, it details the death of Moses and the fact that Joshua took over. So unless he was writing that from heaven, that part wasn't Moses. And most scholars believe that Joshua, after he died, then picked up the pen and finished it out, and then Joshua wrote the next book, which is the book of Joshua. And all I'm telling you, look, it was inspired by God. So Moses sat down and was writing out the story of the Exodus, and he said he was being criticized by Aaron and Miriam, and he goes, but Moses was humble, man. He was the most humble person in all the earth. And like I can just imagine him writing that out and going, like waiting for God to smite him. You know what I mean? Like, but God was like, all right, I'll leave that in there. So it evidently was true, right? It's just crazy. And it reminds me of, I've talked about this before, in the New Testament, in the book of John. So you remember who wrote the book of John, the Gospel of John? John. Okay, John, one of the 12 disciples. He wrote the book of John, and several times in the book of John, when referencing himself, he talks about Peter and James and some of the other disciples, and he goes, then also present was the disciple that Jesus loved. That was him. He referred to himself as he was the disciple that Jesus loved. And again, he wrote that down and was like, God was like, all right, I'll leave that in there. It's fine. And so that got left in there. So it got me thinking, if I were living back then and God allowed me to write the gospel according to Joey, I would have tried it. I would have been like Joe, and Joey was the greatest hunter who ever lived, and God probably would have smoked me. I mean, I probably would have had to scratch it out and go, okay, all right, God. But hey, it doesn't hurt to try. You know what I mean? I just thought that was funny. He says that he's the most humble person on earth. Evidently, it's true. Verse 4. So verse 4, here's what it says. It says, so immediately the Lord called Moses, Aaron, and Miriam and said, go to the tabernacle, all three of you. So this reminds me of my kids. Like when my kids are all fighting with each other, and my wife goes to the living room now, and they're in big trouble, right? They got to come to Jesus moment. And it says, verse 5, it says, then the Lord descended in a pillar of cloud and stood at the entrance of the tabernacle. Aaron and Miriam he called, and they stepped forward, and the Lord said to them, now listen to what I have to say. If there were prophets among you, I, the Lord, would reveal myself in visions. I would speak to them in dreams, but not with my servant Moses. Of all my house, he is the one I trust. That's pretty high praise, okay, coming from God. And he says in verse 8, I speak to him face to face clearly and not in riddles. He sees the Lord as he is. So why were you not afraid to criticize my servant Moses? So now we're getting, you're in big trouble. It says the Lord was angry with them, and he departed. As the cloud moved from above the tabernacle, there stood Miriam, her skin as white as snow from leprosy. When Aaron saw what had happened to her, he cried out to Moses, oh, my master, please don't punish us for our sins, the sins we have so foolishly committed. So he kind of changed his tune, right? It went from jealousy to, oh, my master, right? Now he says, master. He says, verse 12, he says, don't let her be like a stillborn baby already decayed at birth. So Moses cried out to the Lord, oh God, I beg you, please heal her. But the Lord said to Moses, if her father had done nothing more than spit in her face, wouldn't she be defiled for 7 days? So keep her outside the camp for 7 days, and after that, she may be accepted back. So when I read that, the thing that I don't know why, I don't know if you caught this or not. So Aaron and Miriam criticized Moses, their brother, and God goes, come on in the tabernacle, we're going to deal with this. And so God told them they were wrong, and the punishment, the consequence was that Miriam was struck with leprosy. And when I read that, I was like, why wasn't Aaron struck too, right? It was just Miriam. I don't know why. I tried to do some research. I don't know. Whenever I get to heaven, I have a list of questions I'm going to ask God. Like, that's going to be one of them. Like, why? They both criticized Moses. Why did you just strike Miriam with leprosy? you're probably already trying to come to some conclusions. I don't know. You can do your own research, but I just found that to be very interesting. And so let me give you the lesson from this, okay? I don't know of a lot of life lessons from this, but the lesson is that if you criticize your spiritual leaders, God is going to strike you with leprosy. I'm just kidding. I'm joking about that. Like but this was obviously an anomaly. This was a unique situation, but it happened. I mean, in the Old Testament, there were, in fact, let's just move to this next one. And I think this is, I should have put the reference because I'm going to highlight this story. I think it's in the book of Numbers, either 16 or 18, but it's about Korah's rebellion. And Korah was a guy who was a leader in Israel, and he got a lot of people to follow him, and he didn't like Moses. He was jealous of Moses, and he went to Moses, and he was like, who are you to be ordering us around? He's like, you're no better than any of, why are you walking around like you're better than us? I don't know, maybe he was, maybe he wasn't, but Korah challenged his authority. He challenged Moses, and he got a lot of people to follow him, and so Moses, what I like about that story is that Moses didn't engage with him. Like he just took it to the Lord. He was like, I'll be right back. And he went and he talked to God, and God goes, okay, here's what I want you to do. Go tell them to meet tomorrow. So he goes to Korah. He goes, come back here tomorrow. He goes, and we're going to figure out if God is on your side or my side. And so they did this thing. They went through these rituals, and at the end of that, God showed up. And that's called Korah's rebellion. But Korah and his followers were over here, and the ground just opened up and swallowed them and then closed back up like an earthquake or whatever. And God smote 14,700 of them that day. And it was just a wild thing, and for doing nothing more than complaining about their leader, right? And it was a rebellion and all that. And all I'm saying is God just kind of got sick and tired of the children of Israel over and over again. Like he was so good to them. He brought them out of Egypt, out of slavery. He did all these great things for them, and all they do is whine and complain about it. And I think that, I do think there's some spiritual applications for that. Like, I look at all that God has done for me. God has been very, very good to me. And I find myself complaining all the time. And I think God's just like, just a little gratitude would be in order, before you complain about all the stuff that you don't have. All right, so let's get to this last one. Numbers chapter 21. Okay, you got a Bible, turn to Numbers 21. And this is the story. I read this earlier. I read this to begin with. So here's what it says. Verse 4. It says, then the people of Israel set out from Mount Hor, taking the road to the Red Sea to go around the land of Edom. It says, the people grew impatient with the long journey. That stuck out to me when I read that. I was like, so here they are. They're in the desert. There's not a lot of food. There's not a lot of water. They're struggling to get through the desert. And it's dry and sandy. And it says that they grew impatient with the long journey. And I was like, me too. You ever been there before? You ever felt like here's the thing. Like, I know in my life, I know that God has promised me certain things that haven't happened yet. And some of these things, it's been years in the waiting, right? It's been years waiting and waiting. And sometimes we grow weary. We grow impatient in the long journey. And everyone in this room, you're on this long journey from the time you got saved to the time you die or when Jesus comes back. It's a journey, and sometimes the journey is awesome, and sometimes the journey is hard. And, the best thing you can do is go on this journey with other people, like a church body. It's the way that God designed us. But it's not always going to be great. Not every day is going to be on a mountaintop. Some days you're going to be in the valley, and sometimes we grow impatient. Have you been there? Have you grown impatient in the long journey? Like, I look at life. In some ways, life goes by really, really short, and then other times I'm just like, this life drags on and on and on, and it's, so if we're not careful, we just grow impatient. Now, he goes on in verse 5, he says, and the Lord and they began to speak against God and Moses. So what stuck out about this with me is most of the time it was that they spoke against Moses, their leader. Like, they would complain against Moses. They would complain against Moses. This time, they done messed up, right? Because now they complained against God and Moses, right? Sometimes when you read through the the Pentateuch, whenever you read through the journey of 40 years, sometimes they would speak against Moses, and Moses would get mad and tell God to smite them, and God had mercy on them. There were other times, several times, where God was mad at them and began smiting people, and Moses would intercede for them, and God would answer his prayer. And it's just good that it never happened at the same time, because if they were both mad at them, they would have all been smote. So anyways, he goes on. He goes, why have you brought us out of Egypt? They go, why have you brought us out of Egypt to die here in the wilderness? They complained. And there is nothing to eat here and nothing to drink. And we hate this horrible manna. Can you believe that? Like here they are complaining about the manna. Now again, they've been eating it for a while now. So it kind of gets old. I mentioned this last week. My favorite thing to eat, if you gave me like one food for the rest of my life, like one individual food, it would be like medium rare ribeye steak. I would love that like today, like for lunch today. But probably on the 934th meal, I would probably go, I'm sick of steak, right? I would be. You would be too. And so they started to complain, and every time they complained, God would smite some of them. But you know what it reminds me of? So let's just get practical. I've seen this so often, probably in my own life too, but I've seen single people that I know, and year after year they're praying for a spouse. And they're diligent, and they're waiting on Mr. Right or Mrs. Right, and finally they get married, and it's like an answer to prayer. And then you fast forward 5 years later or 10 years later, and now they're complaining about this person that you prayed for your whole life. God gave them to you. Now you take it for granted. Now you're right. I'm not talking about anybody in here specifically, and my wife's in here. I may be talking about her. I don't know, but I'm just saying, but I've seen people do that with their house. You know, I know people who needed a nice house, and God answered their prayer and gave them a great house. And then down the road, they just took it for granted, start complaining, and they looked at other people's nicer house than theirs, and now they're not happy with this. Or people do that with cars, people do that with jobs. And what I'm telling you is we just have to be careful and learn to appreciate where we're at. That doesn't mean that if you have a job that you don't like, not to pray for a better job, but figure out what you can be appreciative in that moment, and don't grow impatient in the long journey. So here I got some memes here. Go to this next slide. This is Mason sent me this one a couple weeks back about manna. He's probably thinking about other women, and he's thinking if the Israelites had turned the manna into breadcrumbs and coated the quail meat with them, they could have made the first chicken nuggets. I know I would have tried something like that, deep fry some quail. Go to the next one. The manna was bad enough. Now we have to cope with this off-brand bottled water. If this was 2023, I already know people, I'm not drinking this, Sam's Club water or whatever. It doesn't have alkaline in it or whatever. I don't know. Go to the next slide. Manna, it's what's for dinner and lunch and breakfast, and that's right. It's just all you're ever gonna. Now, here's the thing. I want you to think about this for a second, because I don't think I talked about this last week, but I intended to. So, for some reason, I had in my mind that the children of Israel ate manna for 40 years in the desert, and that's all they ever ate. And I started thinking about when I was studying for this several weeks ago, and I was like, that can't be right. Like, I don't think the children of Israel only ate manna for 40 years. And so I messaged one of my professors from Baptist Bible College, and I said, is that true? Did they have other things to eat? And he goes, of course they had other things to eat. He goes, the manna was just there to supplement what they didn't have. You know what I mean? Now, don't get me wrong. They're in the desert, and they're there for 40 years. There's not a lot of options, right? But they had, when they left Egypt, they had cattle, they had sheep, they had all kinds of livestock. Now, there's 2 million people, or 1.5 million people, so that's not going to go very far. So they didn't get to eat beef like for every meal, but that's where the manna came in. God provided, if you're hungry, here's some manna, but you don't have to only eat that. They could have went out and caught fish in the Red Sea or whatever. Now, and here's where, when I was thinking about that, so if you look at the book of Genesis and Exodus and then the book of Leviticus. That's the third book in the Bible. Has anyone ever read that from beginning to end? So the book of Leviticus is rough. I'm just being honest with you. It's rough. So I go back to years ago. I've probably shared this story probably 4 or 5 times a year, but it's funny to me. So when I first got saved years ago, I started going to church, and I'd never read the Bible before. And I was so serious about my relationship with God that I told my pastor, I said, I'm going to read the Bible from Genesis to Revelation. And I didn't even know that Revelation was the last book. I was just like, I'm going to read it from cover to cover, and whatever it says to do, that's what I'm going to do. So I started doing that, and I read through the book of Exodus. I started with the book of Genesis, and I had never read those stories before. I was like, this is awesome. This is amazing information. And then I got into the Exodus, and I read through the whole book of Exodus. It's like, this is incredible. And then I got into the book of Leviticus, and it talks about all these laws and dietary restrictions and things, and I was like, I don't know what's going on here. But I came across some passages that said God began to give them dietary restrictions. Like one of the dietary restrictions that they had is they weren't allowed to eat pork. Okay, the Jewish people back then weren't allowed to eat pork, and so no pork chops, no bacon, no ham, no anything, no pig's feet, and so they couldn't eat that. And then I read that, and I was like, So I'm a Christian, and God says not to eat pork, so I'm not going to eat pork no more. I stopped eating bacon. I stopped eating everything that was pork related. And then I read where it's weird. I don't know if you've ever read this before, but it starts to go into detail about you can't eat anything with a split hoof that chews the cud, right? Just weird stuff. And then like you can eat stuff that chews the cud but doesn't have a split. I don't remember. And I just remember thinking, okay, this is deer. Like deer have a split hoof, and I have some deer meat in my freezer, so I can't eat that no more. And so it's chewing the cud is this, like cows chew the cud. So cows have 4 stomachs. So cows will graze all day long. They'll eat a bunch of grass. They'll swallow it. A little bit later in the afternoon, that cud will come back up, and they'll chew on it some more. They'll regurgitate it. They'll chew on it some more, and it'll go down a different stomach until it's gone down all 4. So I know you're grossed out, but that's why there's a whole sermon about that we're supposed to chew on the cud of the Bible, right? You're supposed to read the Bible and then regurgitate it, so to speak, and think about it, meditate on it, chew on that for the rest of the day. Anyways, so in the book of Leviticus, they had all these dietary restrictions. So I stopped eating pork for a couple months. And then I was at church, and I was telling my pastor, I said, boy, being a Christian's hard. And he goes, what do you mean? I said, probably the hardest thing about being a Christian is not being able to eat bacon. And he just started laughing. He goes, where'd you get that? He goes, I just read that in the book of Leviticus. And he's just cracking up laughing. He goes, Joey, and he showed me in the Bible where in the New Testament, Jesus declared all foods clean. So you can eat, you should clap for that. We can eat bacon now, amen. When you get to heaven, it's just going to be a big plate about this size of bacon waiting for you. But so the children of Israel, just think about this. Not only did they have cattle when they left Egypt that they could have ate, they could have caught fish from the Red Sea, they could eat that. They weren't allowed to eat shellfish and different things like that. God gave them all these dietary restrictions, but Jesus changed that in the New Testament. But they also had, because they had the dietary restrictions, God's giving them the laws. You're not allowed to eat shellfish. You're not allowed to eat, something with a split hoof. You're not allowed to eat pork. So evidently they had all these options, right? So they had other things to eat. It's just that the manna came in where they lacked. So for 40 years, they were fully fed. They had a lot of different things to eat, but when you ran low with some stuff, you had the manna that would supplement your diet. So I look at that and say God was good to them. Let's go on verse 6. It says, they complained about the manna, and God's ticked off. God's about to smite some people. God's like, I've been sending you manna, and now you're going to complain about it. Verse 6, it says, so the Lord sent poisonous snakes among the people, and many were bitten and died. They were smote. Verse 7, then the people came to Moses and cried out, we have sinned by speaking against the Lord and against you. Pray that the Lord will take away the snakes. So Moses prayed for the people. Then the Lord told him, make a replica of a poisonous snake and attach it to a pole. All who All who are bitten will live if they simply look at it. So Moses made a snake out of bronze and attached it to a pole, and anyone who was bitten by a snake could look at the bronze snake and be healed. So, go to the next slide. This is what it looked. I don't know if it looked like this, but God told Moses, make a bronze serpent and put it on a pole and hold it up. Anybody who's bitten can look at that and be healed. So I'll give somebody 1,000 points if you know what that's called. Anybody know? 1,000 points. There's a name for it. It starts with an N. There's like the Hebrew word for this. The official word. No? Nobody? It's Neheshtan. Go to the next slide. I probably don't say Neheshtan. That's what it is. And it's referenced a couple more times in the Bible. But think about this. Think about this thing. So the children of Israel, it's really not funny, but I kind of chuckle when I think about that. But they're complaining about the manna that God's been giving them. So God's like, you ungrateful little punks. So I don't know if he said it like that, but he's like, he was mad. So he sent snakes. I don't know if they were cobras. I don't know what they were, but these serpents started going around biting people, and people were dying left and right. And so Moses went and prayed to the Lord and said, will you heal them? Now think about how crazy this, think of how interesting this is. God could have been like, okay, no more snakes, and you're all healed. He didn't do that. He came up with this idea. He said, I'm not going to get rid of the snakes, and you're probably still going to get bit, but here's the solution. I want you, Moses, to fashion a snake out of bronze and hold it up on a pole, and anybody that's bitten, if you look at that, then you will be healed. So here's what I want you to understand, and I wrote this down. Number 3, the bronze snake did not have magical powers. Like the bronze snake didn't have the ability to heal you. Looking at the snake was an act of faith, and God healed in response. Okay? So just think about that. God came up with this plan, and he's like, if you get bit by a snake, all you have to do is look at this pole with the bronze snake on it, and you will be healed. You know why he did that? I mean, I don't know. I can't read God's mind, but I'm sure there were some people that refused to look at it, and so they died. And it wasn't that complicated of a situation. You got bit by a snake. All you have to do is, I'm not going to suck out the venom. I'm not going to, I can't lay hands on you. Like, look at the pole. You got bit by a snake, just look at the pole. And if you did that, you got healed. And if you didn't, then you died, and it's your own fault, right? We will come back to that, but I want you to, this thing, the Neheshtan, is referenced 2 other times in the Bible, and I want you to see. Go to the next slide. This is in 2 Kings 18, and this happened years later. So during the kings, this is years and years and years later, maybe like 100 years later. King Hezekiah takes over as king, and he's one of the good guys. And he goes through, and he's like, after he took over, he was like, all of you guys that are worshiping pagan, and you have set up these pagan altars, I'm tearing them down. So he went through the land, tearing down all the pagan altars, and he's as a leader, returning them to the Lord. In verse 3 it says that he did what was pleasing in the Lord's sight, just as his ancestor David had done. He removed the pagan shrines, smashed the sacred pillars, and cut down the Asherah poles. He broke up the bronze serpent that Moses had made. Now, just stop right there. Why would you do that? They still have this bronze serpent. This is years, maybe hundreds of years later, and they still have this bronze serpent. And it's like, why would you break that up? Well, you read on and it tells you, it says, because the people of Israel had been offering sacrifices to it. The bronze serpent was called Neheshtan. Now, isn't that crazy? Somebody was going through the temple and found that and be like, oh, that's the bronze serpent. Remember back in the day with Moses and Aaron and the snakes biting people? They set it up and they're like, oh, we're going to offer sacrifices to that. Pagans. They're just every time you turn around, they're trying to worship something other than the Lord. And the reason why that was so insidious is because oftentimes when the children of Israel began to worship other pagan gods, they offered human sacrifices like their children. Like they would bring their babies and burn them on the altar of these pagan. It's one of the reasons why God was so angry with them whenever they would do that. And so it's idol worship. So here's what I want to close with this, because this passage, the Neheshtan, is also referenced in the New Testament. The only time it's referenced. But look at this. Just put this next one up. So this is in John chapter 4, and I don't know if you've ever read this before or ever understood this, but Jesus was talking in John chapter 3, and he says this. He goes, as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, the Nehushtan, he goes, so must the Son of Man be lifted up. So Jesus is drawing a parallel. What he's saying is that when Moses did that in the Old Testament, that was a foreshadowing of the cross that was to come. And Jesus was that. Jesus was the representation of the Nehushtan. And so what it is just think about what happened with Moses. Moses was like, if you get bit, all you have to do is look to that pole and you'll be healed. Okay? Now, we have a similar situation. Every person on planet Earth, so to speak, has been bitten. Maybe you weren't bitten by a snake, but you were bitten with the sting of sin. Every person in this room is a sinner, and every person has a date with death because of that. There's consequences. Every person on planet Earth has a consequence coming because here's what it is. We're all in the same boat. We all are sinners by nature, and if you die in that sinful state, you don't get to go to heaven with Jesus for all of eternity. You have to go to hell for all of eternity where you're separated from him. But the solution is not complicated at all. God's not making it like super complicated. He goes, all you have to do is if you're bitten, you just have to look at the pole, right? You as a human being struck with the sin nature, and you're like, how do I get healed from that? You just have to look to Jesus on that cross. That's all you have to do. It's that simple. And what's crazy to me is I know so many people throughout our world. There's people that I know personally that refuse to look to Jesus because of their pride, because of their arrogance, because they just think it's silly. They're like, well, couldn't God come up with a better plan? I don't know. I don't question God. I don't question why he does what he does. I think sometimes it's hilarious, some of the stuff he does, and other times I just don't know. I'm like, but he's God and I'm not. But there's a lot of people that refuse to look to Jesus for their salvation, but that's the only way to get to heaven. Do you understand that? Like you got bit by a snake, you can die, or all you have to do is turn and look at the Nehushtan and you'll be healed. And in your state, you've been bit with the sting of sin, and there's only one solution. You can turn and look to Jesus, or you don't have to, or you can die. And I know a lot of people that are going to refuse to turn and look. But as for me, I've been healed, spiritually speaking, all right? So that's what I want us to think about as we close out. So let's go ahead and let's close our eyes and bow our heads. And I want to bring this back to, again, what we're thankful for and learning to be grateful and not, I don't want to be like the children of Israel that complained about the manna. I'm in a desperate situation, God. I need healing. God, I need this. I'm struggling financially. I need you to come through. And then when God comes through, just go, I'm just complaining about the way God does it or his timing or whatever. And I don't want to be an ungrateful person. I don't want to complain about the manna that God has given me, the blessings that God has provided in my life. I want to learn to be appreciative of those things. And I think that you do too, instinctually. And so I thought we would just think about that. And here's something I want you to think about as we get ready and close out. I'll tell you this quick story. A couple weeks ago, I went up to Michigan to speak at this men's conference, and on the way, I drove through Chicago, and I went to see a pastor friend of mine, and I went in his office, and I sat down, and he looked at me, and first question out of his mouth, he was like, Joey, he goes, how's your soul? And I was like, and I was tempted to just go, yeah, things are good, just lighthearted. But something just struck me that, I was just very emotional. I almost started crying. I don't know why. And I was just I really thought about that question. How's my soul? You ever thought about that before? Have you ever asked that question? How's your soul? That's a deep question. That's more than just, hey, how are you? Oh, I'm good. No. Like, how is your soul? Like right now. Because what I told him is I said, I'm pretty good right now. Like I feel like my soul is in a good place right now. But if you would have asked me that 6 months ago, I'm not sure I would have had the same answer. And 2 years ago, maybe not so much. I don't know. I'm just telling you, like, I'm a work in progress. The rest of my life, I'm working on my soul. And I get so discontented with my life. And here's one of the ways you can determine whether or not you're a grateful person. How much time do you spend complaining and griping about your situation in your life versus how much time do you spend thanking God for all of the things that he's done in your life? And I think God just wants us to cultivate that gratitude of attitude. And I think if you're like me, it's got to be intentional, because I don't naturally live there. I have to force myself to go, okay, God's been really good to me. And it's simple things. Like the other day, me and my son were deer hunting, and we got to see the sunset. It was just really beautiful. And I was just like, thanks, God, just for a beautiful sunset, things that I might ordinarily take for granted. And I think God just wants to hear that. We're his kids, and we just love to hear, he loves to hear praises come from our lips that shower him with praise. So, how's your soul? And if you're not in a good place right now, you need to reach out, I know that the holidays is hard for a lot of people. If you're the person who isolates and retreats because you're not good on the inside, you're not doing very well, I don't know how to heal you and solve all your problems, but get around some people that are going to uplift you. I do know that will help. All right? And so if you're here, I want to bring this to a close with this. If you're here and you have never accepted Christ, it's as simple as looking to the cross. You've been, spiritually speaking, you've been bit by a serpent, and you are going to die spiritually. You're going to die if you don't turn and look to the cross of Jesus. And in doing that, it's an act of faith. It's an act of faith to turn from your sins and turn to Jesus, realizing that I can't get to heaven without some help, and that Jesus on the cross has already provided a way, and all I got to do is look to him for that. If you've never done that and you want to do that today, pray this prayer with me. Just pray this with me. Just say, dear God. Just say, God, right here in this moment, I understand that I'm a sinner. I understand that I've been bitten, spiritually speaking, and that I'm going to die spiritually if I don't turn to you. And so right now, in faith, I turn to Jesus for my salvation. Just tell him, say, God, I look to you. I look to the cross the best way I know how for my healing and my salvation. And it's in Jesus' name that I pray. Amen. Before you leave, if you prayed with me just now, Pastor Chuck is back at the Next Step cart right there in the middle. Just stop by there and talk to him, and he'll give you a packet to help you take your next step. Everyone have a great week. Don't forget about the things coming up. Christmas concerts the 16th. The Ugly Christmas Sweaters the 17th. And no morning service on Christmas Eve. We're going to do 2 evening services that day. And everyone have a great week. God bless you.